But how plausible is it that this account of science, one that displaced long-standing assumptions, or at least rhetoric about how science worked, could be said to have no normative implications for the practice of science? For my part, I find such an assertion quite implausible. At best, it requires drawing an extremely narrow delineation of proper practices of science. Indeed, it should not have any bearing on the kinds of interpretations scientists make of their data in accounting for some or another natural phenomena. As Blackburn points out, scientists don't typically invoke truth as an explanation either. They posit phenomena-specific entities like quarks or gravitational waves or genetic base pairs. We can always look at the justification for these knowledge claims piecemeal without invoking any philosophical conception of truth. But what decades of case studies in STS convincingly show, at least I think so, is that the piecemeal bits of scientific research do not alone turn science into the cultural institution that it is. Science with a capital S. This indeed requires philosophical images of what science represents and attending philosophical notions of truth. It requires ideas of objectivity, reality, objective reality, and all that that means to people. Blackburn's fundamental defense of science is instrumental. Science deserves its authority because it works in all these very specific, practical, and mundane ways. This is certainly a significant part of the story, but it does not fully account for the roles science plays in our societies. This depends on narratives, images, and ideas of science, even the very idea that all these piecemeal inquiries hang together in some coherent way that we can call them all science. And these, not incidentally, are narratives that work in STS, often intentionally, has sought to undermine. So the question is, if we accept the claim that post-truth is in part due to a loss of science's authority, are we to blame? Has STS been successful? Or, as Bruno Latour worried long before any talk of post-truth, has STS gone too far? This argument has been made repeatedly. Here I want to point you to one example that comes out of my former Canadian context. In Canada's third most widely read newspaper, a columnist writes, quote, "For more than a century, various philosophical troublemakers have been trying to undermine science and the scientific method. These include scores of sociological theorists and philosophers who spent much of the 20th century attempting to subvert the first principles of modern Enlightenment science. Throughout the 20th century, science was overwhelmed by the sociology of science and sociological explanations of knowledge. At the extreme, we end up with the idea that there are no facts and nothing is verifiable. Scientific knowledge is seen as customarily accepted belief." This is from Sociological Theories of Scientific Knowledge, an essay by Barry Barnes. Barnes, by the way, was a prominent scholar in early STS and a proponent of a relativistic approach to the sociology of science. The columnist continues, and I quote, "If science were to become a belief system, then the belief with the greatest number of followers would become the established fact and receive knowledge. Knowledge based on observation and rational influence would play second fiddle to what Barnes calls customarily accepted belief. This belief is sustained by consensus and authority. Back when modern science was born, the battle between consensus and new science worked the other way around. More often than not, the consensus of the time, dictated by religion, prejudice, mysticism, and wild speculation, and false premises, was wrong. The role of science, from Galileo to Newton and through the centuries, has been to debunk the consensus and move us forward. But now science has been stripped of its basis in experiment, knowledge, and reason, and the scientific method, and made subject to the consensus created by politics and bureaucrats." End quote. Quite the vehement denunciation of STS's relativistic implications, right? Though this was written more than a decade ago, it foreshadows our post-truth concerns. Okay, but here's the catch. This writer is a prominent climate change skeptic in Canada. He offered this argument in defense of climate change skepticism. Climate change is just one example, but the idea that climate change skeptics or deniers reject the very notion of truth, to use Blackburn's phrase, does not hold up. In fact, recent research in STS suggests the opposite. Climate skeptics are positivists. This columnist is positioning himself as a steadfast protector of science. He is defending, in his own words, Enlightenment science. You can't appeal to a much more classical and heroic conception of science than that. He subscribes to what I think of as the Winston Smith conception of truth. In 1984, Winston is the one person who knows the truth in a world where all knowledge is grounded only in a totalitarian will. It's an intoxicating and comforting notion in response to an existential anxiety that, despite if everyone else thinks the opposite, you can still know the truth. This, incidentally, is a view that climate skeptics and conspiracy theorists tend to share.
So if our post-truth situation is marked by some form of relativism, it's systemic. It's a population-level effect. It doesn't result from a rise in adherence to an individualistic relativism, the view that everyone is entitled to their own truth. It emerges from conflicting claims to the objectively true. When you have thinkers like Steven Pinker pen passionate defenses of Enlightenment rationality, you can imagine these resonating with just as many climate skeptics as climate activists. So this should assuage any fears that STS has corroded classical conceptions of scientific truth to the point that they no longer have any currency. As Lynch argues, it's rather conceited to imagine that STS has that kind of influence. Traditional conceptions of apolitical, objective science remain firmly intact. So much so that an increasing number of actors are trying to speak with the authority of scientific truth. And in this regard, despite all the anxiety about postmodernism, it has been a bit of a misdiagnosis. Jean-François Lyotard predicted the emergence of a postmodern condition marked by a collapse of what he called meta-narratives. The overarching stories that hold together an organized human society had, and would continue to, lose their power, and societies would become more fragmented, sectarian, and polarized. On the face of things, this seems to be a prescient foretelling of our post-truth world. But Lyotard was wrong. The meta-narrative remains intact. What he misdiagnosed was that what holds communities together are not the meta-narratives, it's just the narratives. The narratives have to be actively maintained, shared, and built. The meta-narrative is what one appeals to for philosophical assurance when they don't want to do the hard work of creating the narrative. Take STS's pragmatic account of science. Actual scientific experts cannot hold their communities together with grandiose gestures to metaphysics. They have to do the hard work of actually doing science, collecting evidence, demonstrating why this evidence matters, being confounded by the intransigence of empirical phenomena, offering interpretations, and convincing others of the meaningfulness of these interpretations. What makes a meta-narrative is not its concreteness, but its malleability. Take religion. The existence of a meta-narrative about God, about creation, quite obviously does not preclude fragmentation or even violence. This is true even when the meta-narrative is a shared scripture. The history of Europe is marked by brutal sectarianism between those who are ostensibly part of the same religion. If religion does hold people together, it cannot be done without the piecemeal. Shared spaces, active community building, participation in the same practices. The meta-narrative then adds arrogant confidence to those practices. Collins, Evans, and Weinel also warn about meta-narratives. One example that might emerge from STS is the phrase, "all science is political." But what matters are the actual practices and forms of social organization that enact those politics. That's where the hard work lies. Indeed, all science is political, but this does not mean that all science is merely political, that the practices of scientists and politicians are essentially the same kinds of things. Science is implicated in politics in special ways. Collins and Evans elsewhere argue at length that science's special characteristics, namely of producing substantive expertise, are precisely what allows it to play this special political role. That special role can only be justified by looking at the piecemeal ways that scientists make sense of the world, not by appealing to grand conceptions of scientific truth. The latter is what has led to the very issues of expert accountability with which STS now grapples. However, Collins, Evans, and Weinel misdiagnose a bit too. STS gives no comfort to post-truth politicians by showing that science is political. Arguing that some expert is biased or has ulterior motives has been standard in the politician's playbook for at least a century. But such a claim only holds its rhetorical might if you assume that there is some non-political science to be had. That is, if the claim is asymmetrical. The power of STS's hard work of looking at the various specific, concrete ways in which science is political is that it robs the meta-narrative of scientific truth to add arrogant confidence to political projects. Instead, our politics, that is, our specific projects of enacting our visions of the way we want our world to be, have to be justified with humility and difficult work. The difficult work perhaps gives us some hints about what actually explains the emergence of our post-truth concerns. Take my go-to example for today, climate change. This is a problem that only emerges given our specific techno-scientific arrangements. It has been referred to as a wicked problem, a complex mess of different disciplines of knowledge making, competing politics, different worldviews, and conflicting values. It defies any simple distinction between the social and the natural. How could a classical conception of science make sense of this? So is this what post-truth is? Not a change in the way we see the world, but a drastically changed world, colliding with outdated conceptions of truth.